Hey folks, before the video starts, I want to say big thank you for the feedback you gave me in the last video. Again, I will be short and say, as every other video, to leave a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to comment down below, helping me to give proof to YouTube that all of you who follow this channel so far are real people who watch my videos. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy. I found a secret door at a McDonald's after following a dark web map. The basement was lined with photos of missing people wearing uniforms. You know those moments where boredom gets the better of you and you end up doing something stupid just because it seems harmless at the time? Yeah, that's exactly how this started. I wasn't planning on getting involved in anything creepy. I didn't wake up thinking, hey, let me stumble into something straight out of a horror movie. But here we are. So, it was one of those nights where I couldn't sleep, and I was aimlessly scrolling through YouTube. I ended up watching one of those iceberg videos. You know, the ones where they list progressively weirder internet stories as they go deeper. Somewhere around level 4 or 5, they started talking about a dark website called Lost Coordinates. The whole premise sounded insane, but weirdly intriguing. According to the video, the site would give you random GPS coordinates if you paid a small fee in Bitcoin. The twist: the locations were supposedly tied to unsolved mysteries, abandoned places, or just unexplainable stuff. People in the comments were all like, "Don't try this unless you have a death wish." And this is how horror movies start. But I couldn't help myself. I mean, it's not like I believed any of it was real. I thought it'd just spit out some coordinates for an empty lot or a random gas station, and I'd laugh about wasting $10. Plus, it was almost midnight, and I was running on caffeine and bad decisions. I fired up an old laptop I hadn't touched in years, the one I used to experiment with Tor back in high school. After way too much clicking through shady forums and expired links, I found it. A simple black web page with one button in the middle that said, "Generate coordinates." No logos, no creepy music, no skull and crossbones nonsense. Just a box to enter your Bitcoin payment and a button. So, yeah, I paid $10 in Bitcoin. I still don't know why I went through with it. Maybe it was the boredom, or just plain curiosity, but as soon as I hit that button, the screen flashed, and a set of coordinates appeared. 43.6426 degrees north, 79.3871 degrees west. It was in Toronto. I immediately Googled the location, expecting some empty park or a warehouse, but nope. It was dead center on a McDonald's, like exactly on the building. At first, I laughed. What? Was I supposed to find some ancient mystery hidden under a Big Mac? I almost closed my laptop, but then I noticed something. The McDonald's had reviews, like any other fast food joint, but one of them stood out. It was from 2 years ago, written by someone named Mark S. No profile picture, no other reviews, just a single 1-star comment that said, "Don't go in the basement." I read it at least 5 times. The rest of the reviews were normal. People complaining about the slow drive-thru, the broken ice cream machine, the usual. But that one? It gave me this weird, creeping feeling, like when you realize someone's been watching you for longer than you realized. Still, I figured it was probably just a joke. The dark web was full of trolls, and I'd probably just fallen for some random prank. I closed my laptop and tried to sleep, but the thought wouldn't leave my head. Why would a McDonald's have a basement? Most fast food places don't. And even if they did, Why would someone leave a cryptic review like that? The next day, I tried to forget about it, but the coordinates stuck with me. I kept thinking about how specific they were. Why this McDonald's? Why not an empty field or some abandoned building? There was something deliberate about it, like whoever picked that spot knew it would make people ask questions. By the time Friday rolled around, I had convinced myself that I was being ridiculous. I wasn't going to drive all the way to Toronto to check out a fast food basement just because of some shady website. But then, out of nowhere, my friend Jen texted me about a concert she wanted to go to in Toronto. I took it as a sign. On Saturday, I found myself standing in the parking lot of that McDonald's. The concert wasn't until later that night, so I had time to kill. The building looked completely normal, kind of small, with the same red and yellow signage you see everywhere. A couple of families were inside eating, and the drive-through line stretched around the block. Nothing about it screamed dark web mystery. But the review about the basement wouldn't stop echoing in my head. I walked inside and ordered a coffee to blend in. The staff didn't look creepy or anything. In fact, they were just regular people, teenagers mostly, working a job that looked like it sucked. No one paid any attention to me as I sat down by the window with my coffee. I took out my phone and pretended to scroll through Instagram while I scoped out the place. And that's when I saw it. Near the back of the dining area, past the soda fountain and the condiment station, there was a door. It was plain brown, with no markings or signs to indicate where it led. I wouldn't have thought twice about it if not for the fact that it didn't look like any of the other doors. It wasn't labeled employees only or anything like that. It was just there, quiet, almost like it was trying not to be noticed. I sat there for what felt like forever, waiting for someone to go near it. Finally, after about 15 minutes, one of the employees walked over and unlocked it. She glanced around, almost like she was making sure no one was watching, before slipping inside with a mop bucket. The door clicked shut behind her. I know, I should have just left it alone. There's nothing good waiting behind an unmarked door in a random McDonald's. But I couldn't help myself. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? It's not like I was breaking in or anything. If someone caught me, I could just pretend I was looking for the bathroom. I waited until the employee came back out. She looked pale, like she'd just seen something she couldn't explain, but she didn't say anything. She just locked the door and went back to the counter. That's when I made my move. I casually walked over to the door, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear myself think. I grabbed the handle and gave it a light tug. Locked. Of course. But as I stood there, pretending to tie my shoe, I noticed something. She hadn't fully pulled the mop bucket out of the doorway earlier, and wedged in the hinge was a tiny sliver of yellow plastic. A key card. Alright, so here's where things start getting weird. And by weird, I mean the kind of weird where you're questioning every decision you've ever made, but you keep going anyway because you're too far in to stop. That's exactly where I was when I picked up that key card. It was small and yellow, like the kind they use for hotel rooms. I held it in my hand for a moment, just standing there by the door, pretending like I wasn't about to do something monumentally stupid. The employees at the counter were busy with customers, and no one seemed to notice me. But the key card? It felt heavy. Not physically, but in that this is a bad idea kind of way. I didn't go straight in. At first, I walked back to my table, sat down with my coffee, and waited. I didn't want to look suspicious, so I pulled out my phone and acted like I was texting. but my brain was running 100 miles an hour. What kind of McDonald's uses keycards for their doors? And why did that employee look so freaked out when she came back out? For a second, I told myself I should just leave. This was ridiculous. I'd already gotten in way deeper than I planned, and whatever was behind that door wasn't my problem. But then I remembered the coordinates, the weird review, and how none of this felt like a coincidence. I couldn't let it go. So, after about 10 minutes, when no one seemed to be paying attention, I made my move. The keycard slid into the reader on the door with a soft click. There wasn't any dramatic beep or alarm or anything, just a green light that blinked once before the lock disengaged. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a blast of cold air hit me. Not like the AC you'd expect in a fast food joint. This was different. Damp, almost metallic, like the air in a basement that hasn't seen sunlight in decades. The hallway beyond the door was dimly lit, lined with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. The walls were concrete, gray and unpainted, and the floor was bare cement, with faint stains I didn't want to look at too closely. I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. It locked automatically with a heavy clunk. That was the first moment I realized I might have made a mistake. But instead of turning back, I kept walking. The hallway sloped downward, leading deeper into what I assumed was some kind of storage area. But the further I went, the more it felt wrong, like this wasn't part of the original building. The air got colder, and the faint hum of the restaurant above me started to fade. About 20 feet in, I came to another door. This one was metal, with no handle, just a keypad. I tried the keycard, but it didn't work. For a moment, I stood there, wondering if this was the end of the road. Then I noticed something scratched into the wall next to the keypad. 4, 5, 2, 6. I punched the numbers in, and the door unlocked with a loud click. The room beyond the door was massive, much bigger than I expected. It wasn't a storage room, though. It looked more like some kind of maintenance area, but not for the restaurant. The walls were lined with old electrical panels and pipes that hissed faintly, like they were carrying something other than water. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sickly yellow glow, and the air felt thicker down here, almost suffocating. There were no tables, no chairs, nothing that looked like it belonged in a McDonald's. Just a series of narrow corridors branching off in different directions. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, but then I saw it. At the end of the main hallway, there was a door slightly ajar. It was wooden, cracked, and splintered in places, and it didn't match the rest of the sterile, industrial vibe of the basement. Light spilled out from the gap, faint and flickering, like an old fluorescent bulb on its last leg. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I started to hear something, a faint rustling sound, like paper being shuffled. My first thought was that I'd stumbled onto some weird storage area for old documents or files. Maybe this McDonald's had been built on top of something else, and the basement was just leftovers from the previous building. But when I pushed the door open, I realized how wrong I was. The room was filled with photos. Hundreds, no, thousands of them, pinned to the walls, scattered across tables, hanging from strings like some kind of twisted art installation. Most of the photos were faded, old and discolored, but I could still make out the faces. They were people, men, women, teenagers, even kids, all staring blankly into the camera. Some looked happy, like they'd been caught mid-laugh. Others looked terrified, their eyes wide and desperate, like they were silently begging for help. And then I noticed the uniforms. Almost all of them were wearing McDonald's uniforms. The red polo shirts, the black visors, even the little name tags. But these weren't modern uniforms. They were older, like the kind you'd see in photos from the 80s or 90s. I scanned the room, my stomach twisting into knots. What the hell was this? Why were there so many photos? And why did all these people look like they disappeared decades ago? On the far side of the room, there was a desk. It was covered in more photos, along with stacks of old documents and folders. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I got closer, I noticed a small TV sitting on the desk, one of those old boxy ones from the early 2000s. It was turned on, but the screen was just static. Then it flickered. For a split second, the static was replaced by an image. A man in a McDonald's uniform, sitting in a chair. His head was slumped forward, and his face was obscured by shadows. The image flickered again, and the static returned. I backed away, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the door I'd come through had shut on its own, and it didn't have a handle on this side. I ran to the door and started pounding on it, but the sound barely echoed in the room. The walls felt thicker than they looked, like they were absorbing the noise. No one was going to hear me. Then I heard it. Footsteps, faint and deliberate, coming from one of the corridors outside the room. They were slow, measured, like whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry. I froze, my back pressed against the door. The footsteps got closer, and then they stopped, right outside. Something scratched against the metal of the door, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the surface. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the photos on the walls, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread clawing at my chest. And that's when I noticed one of the photos near the door. It wasn't old like the others. It was new, printed on glossy paper. The face staring back at me was mine. I stared at the photo of myself on the wall, my mind racing. My face was perfectly clear, like it had been taken just hours ago. I could see the shirt I was wearing, the faint coffee stain on my sleeve, even the slight smudge on my glasses. There was no way this photo should exist. The scratching on the other side of the door grew louder. It wasn't random anymore. It sounded deliberate, like someone tracing the outline of the door frame with something sharp. My brain screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. Then the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was suffocating, heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might give me away. And then, a sound. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the door, like someone knocking with the back of their knuckles. I couldn't take it anymore. I stumbled back toward the desk, keeping my eyes on the door. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I needed something, anything, to defend myself. The desk was covered in old papers and scattered photos, but there was nothing useful. No phone, no weapons, just decades of what looked like discarded employee files and schedules. Then I saw it. Sitting beneath a pile of dusty folders was a notebook. Unlike everything else in the room, it didn't look old or worn. The cover was black, with a faint grease stain on the edge, and the corners were bent like someone had been carrying it around recently. I grabbed it and flipped it open. The first page was blank. So was the second. But as I turned the pages, words started to appear. Scrawled in messy handwriting, like it had been written in a rush, were 2 words repeated over and over. "Don't look." The tapping at the door stopped, replaced by the sound of something dragging. It was faint, like fabric or rope being pulled across the floor. I wanted to run, to get out of that room as fast as possible, but there was no way out except through the door, and whatever was on the other side was waiting for me. I flipped further into the notebook, hoping for some kind of explanation. The handwriting got sloppier the deeper I went, like whoever had written it was losing control. Phrases jumped out at me. "They hear you." "Don't touch the walls." "Never stay past close." But one note, circled several times, made my stomach drop. "If they see you, you're already dead." I didn't understand what it meant, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I shoved the notebook into my pocket and started scanning the room for anything that might help me escape. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small vent near the floor, partially hidden behind one of the tables. It was barely big enough to crawl through, but at that moment, I didn't care. I crouched down and started yanking at the metal grate. It was old and rusted, and the screws gave way easily. As I pulled it free, I heard something outside the door. This time, a low, guttural humming. It wasn't a song. It was just one long, continuous tone, like someone humming in a broken rhythm. I didn't wait to find out what was making the noise. I shoved the grate aside and crawled into the vent, dragging it back into place behind me. The metal walls were cold and slick with condensation, and the air smelled like rust and mildew. I had to fight the urge to gag as I started crawling forward. The vent was pitch black, and the only sound was my own breathing echoing back at me. I tried to move as quietly as possible, but every shift of my weight made the metal creak beneath me. I didn't know where the vent led, but anywhere was better than that room. As I crawled, I started to notice something strange. The walls of the vent weren't smooth like I'd expected. They were covered in scratches, long jagged marks that ran in every direction. At first, I thought it was just wear and tear, but the more I looked, the less random they seemed. Some of the marks formed crude shapes, almost like letters, but they didn't spell anything I could understand. And then there was the smell. It wasn't just mildew anymore. It was sharper, like rotting meat mixed with burned plastic. It got stronger the further I went, until I had to cover my mouth and nose with my sleeve just to keep from vomiting. I turned a corner in the vent, and that's when I saw it. Light. Faint and flickering, but unmistakable. It was coming from a grate up ahead, spilling into the vent in a sickly yellow glow. I crawled toward it, desperate for any sign of an exit, but as I got closer, I started to hear something. Voices. The grate opened into another room, much smaller than the first. The walls were covered in the same scratched-up concrete, and the floor was littered with discarded wrappers and papers. But what caught my attention were the people. 3 of them, all wearing McDonald's uniforms, were sitting in a circle on the floor. Their backs were to me, and their heads were bowed like they were praying. But they weren't praying. They were whispering. I couldn't make out what they were saying at first. It was too soft, too quiet, like they didn't want anyone to hear them. But as I watched, their whispers grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. And then, without warning, one of them jerked their head up and turned to look at the grate. I froze. I couldn't see their face clearly in the dim light, but there was something wrong with it. Their skin looked pale and stretched, like it didn't quite fit. Their eyes were wide and glassy, and their mouth hung open in a silent scream. The others didn't react. They just kept whispering, louder and louder, until it felt like the sound was crawling under my skin. The one who had looked at me started to move, slowly getting to their feet. They didn't blink. They didn't even seem to breathe. They just stood there, staring at the grate, like they could see right through me. And then they smiled. I scrambled backward as fast as I could, the sound of my own breathing drowning out everything else. The metal of the vent groaned beneath me, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might collapse. But then the whispering stopped. Dead silence. I didn't stop crawling until I was sure I was far enough away. My hands were slick with sweat, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. But just as I thought I was safe, I heard it again. The humming. It was coming from behind me, growing louder with each passing second, and this time, it wasn't alone. The humming was getting closer. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was something I could feel. It vibrated in my chest, low and deep, like standing too close to a massive speaker at a concert. My instincts screamed at me to move, but I was frozen, crouched in the darkness of the vent. It was only when I heard the first clang, the unmistakable sound of something crawling into the vent behind me, that I snapped out of it. I started moving as fast as I could, scraping my elbows and knees against the jagged metal walls. The humming didn't stop. It was steady, unrelenting, and whatever was making it wasn't far behind. I didn't dare look back. I just kept crawling, twisting and turning through the maze of vents, praying that I'd eventually find an exit. Then I felt it, a shift in the air behind me, like the space around me had changed, grown heavier. My skin prickled, and for a moment, I thought I could feel breath on the back of my neck. I clenched my teeth and crawled faster, ignoring the way the metal creaked dangerously beneath me. Suddenly, the vent tilted downward. I couldn't stop myself. I slid forward, my hands scrabbling for anything to hold on to. The walls of the vent were slick, and before I knew it, I was sliding uncontrollably, the humming growing louder and louder as I plunged deeper into whatever nightmare this was. I hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the air out of my lungs. The vent spat me out into another room, and I barely had time to register my surroundings before the humming cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, like my ears were ringing from the absence of noise. I scrambled to my feet, breathing hard. The room was cold, much colder than the vent had been, and the air smelled faintly of bleach and something metallic. The walls were smooth concrete, lined with industrial shelves that held strange, unmarked boxes. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering weakly, casting long, jittery shadows across the floor. In the center of the room was a table. No chairs, no clutter, just a single metal table with a laptop sitting on top of it. The screen was on, but the display was a stark white, like it was waiting for something. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct I had screamed at me to leave it alone, but there was nowhere else to go. The vent I'd fallen from was too high to climb back into, and the only door in the room was locked, its keypad glowing faintly red. I approached the table slowly, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The laptop screen flickered, and for a brief moment it displayed a word in bold black letters. Welcome. I froze. The word disappeared, replaced by a blank field and a blinking cursor, like it was waiting for me to type something. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. I didn't know what it wanted, but I couldn't stand the silence anymore. I typed, "What is this place?" The screen stayed blank for a moment, and I thought it wasn't going to respond. Then, one word appeared. "Wrong." The word flashed red before disappearing, and a new message appeared. "Why did you come here?" My hands shook as I typed again. "I didn't mean to." The response was instant. "Yes, you did." I backed away from the table, my breathing shallow. The screen flickered, and a new image appeared. A live feed of the room I was standing in. I could see myself on the screen, every detail perfectly clear, the sweat on my face, the blood on my scraped hands, the look of sheer panic in my eyes. Then the camera shifted. It panned slowly, turning to face the door behind me. There was someone standing there. I spun around, but the door was still locked, the keypad glowing red. No one was there. But when I turned back to the screen, the figure was still visible. It was tall, its features obscured by the grainy feed, but I could tell it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It just stood there, watching me through the monitor. The screen flickered again, and the figure was gone, replaced by another message. "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran to the door, pounding on it with both fists. The keypad blinked red at me mockingly, and I felt the rising panic clawing at my throat. Then I remembered the notebook. I pulled it from my pocket and flipped through it frantically, looking for anything that might help. Toward the back, scrawled in the same frantic handwriting, was a sequence of numbers, 7214. I punched it into the keypad, and to my relief, the door unlocked with a soft beep. I didn't stop to think. I threw the door open and bolted down the hallway beyond it. The walls were lined with pipes, some of them dripping with foul-smelling liquid, and the floor was slick and uneven. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting everything in a nauseating strobe effect. The hallway seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I was sure I should have run into a dead end by now, but every time I turned a corner, the hallway just kept going. The air grew heavier, colder, and the humming started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. Then I heard the footsteps. They were distant, almost drowned out by the humming, but they were unmistakable, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, I saw a door up ahead. It was metal, dented and rusted, but it was open. I sprinted toward it, my legs screaming in protest, and threw myself through it, just as the humming reached a deafening pitch. The door slammed shut behind me, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The room I was in now was completely different from the others. It was smaller, darker, with walls covered in faded posters and menus. It looked like an abandoned break room. A table sat in the center, covered in wrappers and empty cups. In the corner was an old fridge, its door hanging open, the shelves inside coated with mold. But what caught my attention was the bulletin board on the far wall. It was covered in photos. They weren't like the ones I'd seen earlier. These were newer, clearer, and every single one of them was of people I recognized. The employees I'd seen upstairs, the customers who'd been sitting in the dining area when I walked in, even the woman who had been working the drive-thru. And at the very bottom of the board, pinned with a single rusted tack, was a photo of me. I couldn't take my eyes off the photo. It was the same one I'd seen in the basement earlier, but this time, something was different. The background in the picture wasn't the McDonald's dining area anymore. It was the room I was standing in right now. My throat tightened as I looked around the break room. The angle of the photo matched perfectly, down to the peeling paint on the wall behind me. But there was no camera in sight, no lens, no hidden setup, just the silent, suffocating emptiness of the room. The buzzing sound was back, faint but growing, vibrating in the air around me. I grabbed the edges of the bulletin board and yanked, sending tacks and photos scattering to the floor. Behind it was nothing but concrete. I pressed my hands against the wall, frantically searching for seams or hidden panels, but it was solid. That's when the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out. The darkness was absolute. I couldn't even see my own hands in front of my face. The buzzing grew louder, almost rhythmic, like it was pulsing in time with my heartbeat. My chest tightened as I backed into a corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. And then I heard it. A voice. It wasn't a voice like you or I would make. It sounded warped, distorted, like it had been run through a dozen broken speakers. It came from somewhere above me, impossibly deep and layered, as if it was several voices speaking at once. You shouldn't be here. The words echoed in my skull, not just in my ears, and I felt my body seize up. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. The voice spoke again, this time louder, angrier. You shouldn't be here. The lights flickered back on, and for a split second, I saw it. Standing in the doorway was the figure from the monitor. It was impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its face, if you could call it that, was a pale, featureless oval, like a mannequin that had been stretched and warped. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it staring at me. I scrambled backward, knocking over the table in my panic. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, blocking the only exit. The buzzing in the air was deafening now, and I felt like my head was going to split open. Then it took a step forward. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a chair, and hurled it at the figure. It shattered against its chest, like it was made of glass. The thing didn't even flinch. It just kept moving toward me, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Desperate, I ran for the fridge in the corner. It was the only other thing in the room that looked like it might lead somewhere. The door was already half open, and as ridiculous as it seemed, I yanked it wider and climbed inside. To my shock, the back of the fridge wasn't solid. Instead, it opened into another corridor, this one even narrower and darker than the others. The walls were rough and uneven, like they'd been carved out of stone, and the floor sloped downward into the blackness. The buzzing behind me grew louder, and I didn't stop to think. I crawled through the fridge and into the corridor, pulling the door shut behind me. The sound of the fridge closing was muffled, swallowed by the oppressive darkness around me. I ran. The corridor felt endless, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. My breath echoed back at me, and I kept expecting to feel something grab me from behind. But the buzzing seemed to fade the further I went, replaced by an eerie silence. Then I saw it. Light. Not the sickly yellow glow of the basement, but natural light, filtering in from a crack in the wall ahead. I stumbled toward it, my legs burning, and found myself at a narrow opening barely wide enough to squeeze through. I forced my body through the gap, scraping my arms and sides on the jagged edges, and tumbled out onto cold, wet asphalt. I was in an alley. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the dumpsters and graffiti-covered walls around me. My hands were bleeding, my clothes were torn, and my body ached in ways I didn't think were possible. But I was out. I staggered to my feet, leaning against the wall for support, and looked around. The alley opened onto a street I didn't recognize, but in the distance, I could see the familiar golden arches of the McDonald sign. I didn't go back. I didn't even stop to catch my breath. I just started walking, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. It wasn't until I got back to my car that I realized I still had the notebook. It was stuffed into my pocket, damp and crumpled, but otherwise intact. I opened it, flipping through the pages again, hoping to find something, anything that would explain what I'd just been through. But the pages were blank, every single one of them. I tossed the notebook onto the passenger seat and started the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get as far away as possible. I don't know what that place was or why it exists. I've tried looking it up, but there's nothing. No rumors, no urban legends, nothing that even comes close to explaining what I saw. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the buzzing. It's faint, barely audible, but it's there. And every time I check my phone, there's a new notification, a photo of me. I downloaded an early version of Uber from the dark web. My driver's profile included my exact route before I even entered the address. Alright, let me preface this by saying I'm not usually the kind of person who messes around with shady stuff online. I don't do hacking, I don't mess with illegal downloads, and I definitely don't go exploring the dark web. But, you know those nights where you're just lying in bed, scrolling on TikTok or Instagram Reels, and you fall into the weirdest rabbit holes? That's where this all started. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I was in that half-awake state where everything seems like a good idea. I stumbled on this TikTok where some dude was talking about apps you can find on the dark web. He wasn't showing anything illegal, at least not directly, but he mentioned this one app called the Black Car Network. He said it was like Uber, but faster, cheaper, and way more exclusive. The way he described it made it sound almost luxurious, like you wouldn't just get a ride, you'd get a whole experience. Normally, I just scroll past something like that, but for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of this underground version of Uber felt mysterious. Plus, I figured it was probably just some knockoff service or a reskinned app. What's the worst that could happen, right? So, curiosity got the better of me. I got up, fired up my laptop, and downloaded Tor. If you don't know, Tor is this browser that lets you access the dark web. It's not illegal to use it, by the way. Just sketchy if you don't know what you're doing. I've used it once or twice before to look up random stuff, but this time, I went deeper than usual. After digging through a few forums, I found a thread talking about the Black Car Network. Most of the comments were pretty vague, but a couple of people swore by it. One person said it was their go-to for late-night rides. Another mentioned that it was faster and more reliable than mainstream apps. But then there were a few warnings, things like, don't use it unless you know what you're doing, and once you're in, you're in. I ignored the warnings, obviously. The thread had a download link, and without thinking twice, I clicked it. Within seconds, the APK file was on my phone. For those who don't know, APK files are just the installation files for Android apps. I had to bypass a few security warnings to install it, but again, I figured it wasn't a big deal. When the app finally opened, I was surprised by how polished it looked. The interface was sleek, black and gold, with sharp typography. The logo was just a simple silhouette of a car, but it somehow felt ominous, like it wasn't trying too hard to impress you, because it didn't need to. The home screen was bare, just a map and a request ride button. There weren't any ads, no complicated menus, nothing. Honestly, it felt more professional than the regular Uber app. But here's where things started to get weird. The app had already pinpointed my exact location, not like a general area, but exactly where I was. The Starbucks on Main Street, down to the table I was sitting at. I hadn't even entered my address, but the app somehow already knew. At first, I figured it was just using GPS, which isn't that crazy. What really freaked me out was the destination it had automatically set, my apartment. I hadn't given the app permission to access anything yet. I mean, I'd installed it, but I hadn't entered any information, saved any locations, or linked it to my accounts. How the hell did it know where I lived? I stared at my phone, debating whether to delete the app right then and there. But the thing is, I'm stubborn. Part of me wanted to figure out how it worked. So, like an idiot, I decided to test it out. I hit confirm ride. Immediately, a profile popped up for the driver. His name was Tommy, and his profile picture was a blurry photo of a man wearing sunglasses. The picture looked like it had been taken in a hurry. He was sitting in what looked like a car dealership or a waiting room. The background was out of focus, and his expression was completely blank. Beneath his name, there was some basic info. Car, black sedan. Rating, 4.9 stars. Completed rides, 666. Yeah, 666. I know. Creepy, right? I chuckled nervously, thinking it was just a weird coincidence. The app notified me that Tommy was 3 minutes away. That seemed way too fast, considering I hadn't seen any cars nearby when I looked outside earlier. Still, I waited. Sure enough, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb in exactly 3 minutes. I hesitated for a moment before getting in. My gut was telling me to walk away, but my brain was like, "You've already come this far. Don't chicken out now." When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was how clean the car was. Like, too clean. There wasn't a single speck of dust, no air fresheners, no gum wrappers in the cup holders. The seats looked brand new, and the air inside was stale. Tommy didn't say a word as I got in. He just glanced at me through the rearview mirror, gave a small nod, and started driving. At first, everything seemed normal. The car was smooth, the route was accurate, and Tommy wasn't doing anything weird. But then I noticed something strange on my phone. The app had updated. There was now a new line of text beneath Tommy's profile. "Don't speak to the driver." I thought it was some kind of joke, maybe a glitch. But when I tried to ask Tommy a question, he didn't respond. He just kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly I could see his knuckles turning white. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from the app. Passenger activity detected. No phones during the ride. I felt a chill run down my spine. How the hell did the app know I was using my phone? That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. So there I was, sitting in this eerily clean car with this guy Tommy, who hadn't said a word since I got in. The streetlights were casting long shadows across his face, and the way they flickered in and out of the car made him look less like a real person and more like, I don't know, a mannequin. His movements were too precise. Turn signal on exactly 3 seconds before a turn, speed perfectly steady. I tried to calm myself down. I mean, maybe this was just one of those drivers who took their job way too seriously. But the thing that kept eating at me was the way the app seemed alive. First, it knew my pickup and drop-off points before I even entered them, and now it was sending these creepy, almost omniscient notifications. As we drove, I noticed something weird about the route. It didn't feel right. At first, it was subtle. Tommy wasn't taking the quickest way to my apartment, but I figured maybe he was avoiding traffic or construction. Then he made a left turn onto a road I'd never seen before. I pulled up Google Maps on my phone to check the route, but it showed we were still on Main Street. That wasn't possible. I looked out the window, and the streets were completely different, darker, emptier, with fewer streetlights. "Hey, Tommy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is this a shortcut or something? I think we're off course." No answer. "Tommy?" I tried again. He didn't even blink. He just kept driving. I pulled out my phone to text my friend Jake, but the moment I opened my messages, another notification popped up from the app. No phones during the ride. I glanced up at Tommy, and for a split second, I thought I saw his lips twitch into a small smile. Just a flicker of an expression, but it was enough to send my anxiety into overdrive. I ignored the notification and started typing anyway. "Jake, I'm in this weird Uber situation. If you don't hear from me in 20 minutes, call." Before I could finish the text, my phone buzzed again. "Warning, violation detected." The app screen went black for a second before flashing back to life. Now, instead of the map or Tommy's profile, it showed a live feed from a camera. It took me a second to realize it wasn't from the front of the car or some traffic cam. It was from inside the car. The camera was pointed at me. My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, then up at the rearview mirror. Tommy's eyes weren't on the road anymore. He was staring at me through the mirror, his head slightly tilted. "All right, this isn't funny," I said, my voice cracking. "Just pull over and let me out." He didn't respond. Instead, he made another turn, and now we were driving down what looked like a service road, narrow, with no markings or lights. The trees on either side were so dense they looked like walls. I checked the app again, desperate to cancel the ride, but the button was gone. The only thing left on the screen was a single message: "You cannot cancel once the route has been set." At this point, I wasn't just scared, I was furious. I started banging on the partition between the front and back seats. "Let me out of the car, man. I'm not kidding." Tommy didn't even flinch. The car kept moving, steady as ever. That's when I noticed something even weirder. The app wasn't just tracking the route anymore. It had added details. On the screen, next to a live map, was a timestamp for every turn Tommy had made. Each turn had a label: left turn, 10:43 p.m., right turn, 10:47 p.m., and so on. But beneath each timestamp was something else: passenger response. Uneasy, passenger response. Attempted to use phone, passenger response. Agitated. It was tracking my emotions. I felt like I was going to throw up. I looked around the car, trying to spot where the cameras were, but everything looked normal. No blinking lights, no hidden lenses, just the back of Tommy's head, perfectly still, as he drove into the middle of nowhere. We passed an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The pumps were rusted, the neon sign flickering weakly. For a second, I thought about jumping out of the car, but the locks wouldn't budge. Every time I tried pulling the handle, it felt like it was welded shut. Then the car slowed down, not like it was stopping, but more like it was creeping, rolling forward at an unnaturally slow pace. Up ahead, I saw a building, just barely visible through the trees. It looked like an abandoned diner, the kind you see in small towns that haven't updated their decor since the 1950s. The windows were boarded up, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The app buzzed again. Destination updated. I opened it, and the new address wasn't my apartment anymore. It was just coordinates, latitude and longitude. I copied them into Google Maps, and my blood ran cold when I saw what popped up. There was no official address, just a label. No name site. I started pounding on the partition again, yelling at Tommy to stop the car. But he didn't even flinch. If anything, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then I noticed his face in the rearview mirror. He wasn't blinking. The car came to a stop in front of the diner. My phone buzzed one last time. "You have reached your destination." Before I could say anything, the locks clicked open. The app displayed a new message. "Exit the vehicle." I stayed frozen in my seat, my hands gripping the edge of the door. Tommy didn't move. He didn't look at me or say a word. He just sat there, staring straight ahead like he was waiting for me to leave. "I'm not getting out," I said, my voice trembling. The app buzzed again, but this time, the notification wasn't from the Black Car Network. It was a text message from an unknown number. All it said was, "Get out or he will." I didn't need to ask who he was. As I reached for the door handle, the air in the car suddenly felt heavier, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. My vision blurred, and I thought I could hear faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but definitely there. I stepped out of the car, and the door slammed shut behind me. When I turned around, the car was gone. Not driving away, just gone. The whispers were louder now, coming from the diner, and then the lights inside flickered on. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the flickering lights inside the diner. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Cracked windows, rust-streaked siding, weeds pushing up through the concrete. But the lights were on, and they weren't the dim yellow glow you'd expect from an old building. They were bright, almost fluorescent, flickering in an unnatural rhythmic pattern that reminded me of static on an old TV. The whispers I'd heard in the car hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now. I couldn't tell if they were coming from inside the diner or from somewhere in the woods around me. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and rust, and the silence between the whispers was so deep it made my ears ring. I glanced at my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, but my signal was completely gone. The app for the Black Car Network was still open though, and the screen now showed a single message. "Enter the building." Beneath that, there was a countdown timer. 10 o'clock. It was already ticking down. 9:59, 9:58, 9:57. My hands started to shake as I stared at the screen. What happens when the timer hits 0? I didn't want to find out, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to go inside that building. I tried the door to the diner. It was locked. For a split second, I felt relief. Maybe this was all some sick prank, and I could just wait it out until someone came looking for me. Then I heard it, a click behind me. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see Tommy's car again, but no, It wasn't him. The sound had come from the woods. In the darkness between the trees, something moved. It wasn't the kind of movement you'd expect from a deer or a stray dog. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something watching me, waiting for me to notice. The whispers grew louder, almost like a chant now, and I realized something horrifying. They weren't random. They were repeating the same thing over and over, but the words were too garbled to understand. I backed up until my shoulder blades hit the door of the diner. The app on my phone buzzed violently, and the screen flashed a new message. Enter the building. 7:42 remaining. I didn't know what else to do. I reached for the door again, and this time it opened with a groan that echoed into the stillness of the night. The air inside was stale and cold, like stepping into a meat locker, and the whispers abruptly stopped the second I crossed the threshold. The diner's interior was frozen in time, but not in a nostalgic way. We passed an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The pumps were rusted, the neon sign flickering weakly. For a second, I thought about jumping out of the car, but the locks wouldn't budge. Every time I tried pulling the handle, it felt like it was welded shut. Then the car slowed down, not like it was stopping, but more like it was creeping, rolling forward at an unnaturally slow pace. Up ahead, I saw a building, just barely visible through the trees. It looked like an abandoned diner, the kind you see in small towns that haven't updated their decor since the 1950s. The windows were boarded up, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The app buzzed again. Destination updated. I opened it, and the new address wasn't my apartment anymore. It was just coordinates, latitude and longitude. I copied them into Google Maps, and my blood ran cold when I saw what popped up. There was no official address, just a label. No name site. I started pounding on the partition again, yelling at Tommy to stop the car. But he didn't even flinch. If anything, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then I noticed his face in the rearview mirror. He wasn't blinking. The car came to a stop in front of the diner. My phone buzzed one last time. You have reached your destination. Before I could say anything, the locks clicked open. The app displayed a new message. Exit the vehicle. I stayed frozen in my seat, my hands gripping the edge of the door. Tommy didn't move. He didn't look at me or say a word. He just sat there, staring straight ahead like he was waiting for me to leave. I'm not getting out, I said, my voice trembling. The app buzzed again, but this time the notification wasn't from the Black Car Network. It was a text message from an unknown number. All it said was, "Get out or he will." I didn't need to ask who he was. As I reached for the door handle, the air in the car suddenly felt heavier, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. My vision blurred, and I thought I could hear faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but definitely there. I stepped out of the car, and the door slammed shut behind me. When I turned round, the car was gone. Not driving away, just gone. The whispers were louder now, coming from the diner, and then the lights inside flickered on. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the flickering lights inside the diner. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Cracked windows, rust-streaked siding, weeds pushing up through the concrete. But the lights were on, and they weren't the dim yellow glow you'd expect from an old building. They were bright, almost fluorescent, flickering in an unnatural, rhythmic pattern that reminded me of static on an old TV. The whispers I'd heard in the car hadn't stopped. If anything, They were louder now. I couldn't tell if they were coming from inside the diner or from somewhere in the woods around me. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and rust, and the silence between the whispers was so deep it made my ears ring. I glanced at my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, but my signal was completely gone. The app for the Black Car Network was still open though, and the screen now showed a single message: enter the building. Beneath that, there was a countdown timer, 10 o'clock. It was already ticking down. 9:59, 9:58, 9:57. My hand started to shake as I stared at the screen. What happens when the timer hits 0? I didn't want to find out, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to go inside that building. I tried the door to the diner. It was locked. For a split second, I felt relief. Maybe this was all some sick prank, and I could just wait it out until someone came looking for me. Then I heard it. A click behind me. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see Tommy's car again. But no, it wasn't him. The sound had come from the woods. In the darkness between the trees, something moved. It wasn't the kind of movement you'd expect from a deer or a stray dog. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something watching me, waiting for me to notice. The whispers grew louder, almost like a chant now, and I realized something horrifying. They weren't random. They were repeating the same thing over and over, but the words were too garbled to understand. I backed up until my shoulder blades hit the door of the diner. The app on my phone buzzed violently, and the screen flashed a new message. Enter the building. 7:42 remaining. I didn't know what else to do. I reached for the door again, and this time it opened with a groan that echoed into the stillness of the night. The air inside was stale and cold, like stepping into a meat locker, and the whispers abruptly stopped the second I crossed the threshold. The diner's interior was frozen in time, but not in a nostalgic way. We passed an old gas station that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The pumps were rusted, the neon sign flickering weakly. For a second, I thought about jumping out of the car, but the locks wouldn't budge. Every time I tried pulling the handle, it felt like it was welded shut. Then the car slowed down, not like it was stopping, but more like it was creeping, rolling forward at an unnaturally slow pace. Up ahead, I saw a building, just barely visible through the trees. It looked like an abandoned diner, the kind you see in small towns that haven't updated their decor since the 1950s. The windows were boarded up, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The app buzzed again. Destination updated. I opened it, and the new address wasn't my apartment anymore. It was just coordinates, latitude and longitude. I copied them into Google Maps, and my blood ran cold when I saw what popped up. There was no official address, just a label. No name site. I started pounding on the partition again, yelling at Tommy to stop the car. But he didn't even flinch. If anything, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Then I noticed his face in the rearview mirror. He wasn't blinking. The car came to a stop in front of the diner. My phone buzzed one last time. You have reached your destination. Before I could say anything, the locks clicked open. The app displayed a new message. Exit the vehicle. I stayed frozen in my seat, my hands gripping the edge of the door. Tommy didn't move. He didn't look at me or say a word. He just sat there, staring straight ahead like he was waiting for me to leave. "I'm not getting out," I said, my voice trembling. The app buzzed again, but this time the notification wasn't from the Black Car Network. It was a text message from an unknown number. All it said was, "Get out, or he will." I didn't need to ask who he was. As I reached for the door handle, the air in the car suddenly felt heavier, like all the oxygen had been sucked out. My vision blurred, and I thought I could hear faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but definitely there. I stepped out of the car, and the door slammed shut behind me. When I turned around, the car was gone, not driving away, just gone. The whispers were louder now, coming from the diner, and then the lights inside flickered on. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the flickering lights inside the diner. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Cracked windows, rust-streaked siding, weeds pushing up through the concrete. But the lights were on, and they weren't the dim yellow glow you'd expect from an old building. They were bright, almost fluorescent, flickering in an unnatural, rhythmic pattern that reminded me of static on an old TV. The whispers I'd heard in the car hadn't stopped. If anything, they were louder now. I couldn't tell if they were coming from inside the diner or from somewhere in the woods around me. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and rust, and the silence between the whispers was so deep it made my ears ring. I glanced at my phone, hoping to call someone, anyone, but my signal was completely gone. The app for the Black Car Network was still open though, and the screen now showed a single message: "Enter the building." Beneath that, there was a countdown timer. 10 o'clock. It was already ticking down. 9:59, 9:58, 9:57. My hand started to shake as I stared at the screen. What happens when the timer hits 0? I didn't want to find out, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to go inside that building. I tried the door to the diner. It was locked. For a split second, I felt relief. Maybe this was all some sick prank, and I could just wait it out until someone came looking for me. Then I heard it, a click behind me. I turned around slowly, half expecting to see Tommy's car again. But no, it wasn't him. The sound had come from the woods. In the darkness between the trees, something moved. It wasn't the kind of movement you'd expect from a deer or a stray dog. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something watching me, waiting for me to notice. The whispers grew louder, almost like a chant now, and I realized something horrifying. They weren't random. They were repeating the same thing over and over, but the words were too garbled to understand. I backed up until my shoulder blades hit the door of the diner. The app on my phone buzzed violently, and the screen flashed a new message. "Enter the building. 7:42 remaining." I didn't know what else to do. I reached for the door again, and this time it opened with a groan that echoed into the stillness of the night. The air inside was stale and cold, like stepping into a meat locker, and the whispers abruptly stopped the second I crossed the threshold. The diner's interior was frozen in time, but not in a nostalgic way. The farther the counter and the front windows seemed to get, it was like I was running in place. Behind me, I heard movement. Not footsteps, but something dragging, long deliberate scrapes across the floor, like claws or metal scraping against concrete. I didn't dare look back. My phone buzzed in my hand, and I glanced down without stopping. A new message flashed across the screen. "Don't turn around." The dragging sound grew louder. I forced myself to focus on what was ahead. The diner stretched on, endless rows of booths fading into the darkness. But then, finally, I saw something. A door at the far end, glowing faintly in the black void. It wasn't the front door I'd come through. It was smaller, like a maintenance door, and the light around it pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. The dragging sound was closer now, accompanied by a wet, guttural noise that I can only describe as someone choking on their own breath. My chest felt tight, my legs burning, but I pushed myself harder. My phone buzzed again. Faster. I didn't need the reminder. The door wasn't getting any closer. No matter how fast I ran, it stayed just out of reach, mocking me. My legs started to falter, and I could feel the thing behind me closing in. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of iron and something sweet, like rotting fruit. And then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered back on. The diner was back to normal, or as normal as it could be. The booths were empty again, the jukebox silent. The dragging noise stopped. But I wasn't alone. Sitting at the counter was me. It wasn't like the version of me I'd seen on the app. This one was identical. Same clothes, same face, same panicked look in its eyes. It sat hunched over a cup of coffee, its hands trembling as it brought the mug to its lips. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The thing at the counter looked up at me, its eyes wide with terror. "Don't let it take me," it said, its voice barely a whisper. What are you talking about?" I stammered, stepping closer, despite every instinct screaming at me to run. "You don't understand," it said, its voice breaking. "It's going to replace me. Replace you." Before I could respond, the lights flickered again, and the air around us seemed to ripple, like heat waves on asphalt. The other me stood up, its body jerking awkwardly, and pointed to the maintenance door. "You have to go," it said. The lights went out again. This time, the darkness was different. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt alive, pressing against my skin, seeping into my lungs. I couldn't see the booths, the counter, or even my own hand in front of my face. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of iron was stronger now, almost overwhelming. I heard a voice, a deep, guttural growl that didn't belong to anything human. "You're not supposed to be here," it said, the words echoing inside my head. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shape, tall, impossibly thin, emerged from the darkness. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't have a face, just smooth, pale skin where its features should have been. The thing moved closer, its movements jerky and insect-like. I backed away, but my foot caught on something, and I fell hard onto the tile floor. My phone skittered out of my hand, and the screen lit up with another message. "Crawl." I didn't question it. I scrambled on all fours toward the glowing maintenance door, my palms scraping against the rough tiles. The thing behind me let out a low, guttural screech that made my ears ring. The door was closer now, pulsing with that eerie, rhythmic light. I reached out for the handle, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, I felt a surge of heat, like grabbing a live wire. The screeching stopped. The door swung open on its own, and I tumbled through, landing hard on the other side. I expected to find myself outside, maybe in the woods or even back at the diner parking lot, but I wasn't. The room I was in was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet. The walls were covered in what looked like old, faded photographs, each one showing the same thing: a person sitting in the back seat of a car. The faces were blurred, but the cars were identical, sleek black sedans, just like the one Tommy had been driving. In the center of the room was a single chair, bolted to the floor. It was old, rusted, with leather straps hanging from the armrests and legs, and sitting on the chair was a phone. It looked just like mine. The screen lit up as I approached, displaying a single message. "It's your turn." The door behind me slammed shut, and I was plunged into darkness again. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping, and frantic. I reached for the phone on the chair, and the second I touched it, the whispers stopped. The screen showed a live feed. It was me, but not in the room. The feed showed me sitting in the back seat of a black car, staring blankly ahead. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The phone buzzed in my hand, and a final message appeared. "Welcome to the network." And then the lights came back on. I wasn't in the room anymore. I was in the back seat of the black car. Tommy was driving, his hand steady on the wheel. And in the rearview mirror, I saw my own face staring back at me. But it wasn't me. I don't know how long I sat there in the back seat of the car, staring into the rearview mirror at the thing wearing my face. The more I looked, the more wrong it seemed. Its movements were too stiff, too deliberate. When it blinked, the motion was delayed, like it was running on lag. Meanwhile, Tommy drove in silence, his face as unreadable as ever. The scenery outside the windows was pitch black, even though the dashboard clock said it was just past 11 p.m. There were no streetlights, no signs, no buildings, just darkness stretching out in every direction. I glanced at my phone, desperate for answers, but the screen was blank now. No messages, no maps, just the faint glow of the lock screen. I tried pressing the power button, but nothing happened. Then the thing in the mirror spoke. "You're not supposed to be here." Its voice wasn't mine anymore. It was deeper, almost robotic, like a recording being played backward. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice shaking. It smiled, that horrible stretched smile I'd seen on the app. "You're in transit," it said. "Transit to where?" I demanded, my panic rising. The thing tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. "To the next stop, just like the others." I didn't want to know what the next stop meant. I tried the door handle again, hoping I could jump out, but just like before, it wouldn't budge. It felt like part of the car itself, fused into the frame. My phone buzzed in my hand, the vibration so sharp it made me flinch. The screen lit up with a single new message. "Stay calm. You're almost there." I glanced up at the rearview mirror, and the thing wearing my face grinned wider. It wasn't looking at me anymore. It was looking past me. Slowly, I turned around. The back seat was empty. No, not empty. Wrong. The space behind me stretched back farther than it should have, like the car's interior was growing, expanding into something impossible. The seats and walls warped and twisted, fading into darkness that seemed to pulse, like it was alive. Then, out of that darkness, I saw them. Faces. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. They were faint, like reflections on a dirty mirror, but they were there. Men, women, kids, all staring at me, their mouths slightly open like they were trying to scream but couldn't make a sound. My stomach churned, and I whipped back around to face the front. "What is this? What the hell is happening?" I shouted at Tommy. For the first time, he turned his head slightly, just enough for me to see his profile. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was the same robotic, distorted voice as the thing in the mirror. "You're part of the network now." The car began to slow, and I realized the scenery outside had changed. The endless darkness was gone, replaced by faint shapes in the distance. trees, buildings, streets. The dashboard clock still read 11 p.m., but I could see sunlight peeking over the horizon. It didn't make sense. We pulled up to a house. Not my house, though it looked eerily similar. The same layout, the same porch, even the same blue shutters. But it was different, off in ways I couldn't explain. The thing in the mirror turned to me, its hollow eyes locked on mine. "This is your stop," it said. The doors unlocked with a soft click. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. "I'm not getting out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The thing's smile faded. Its face twisted into something unrecognizable, its features warping like melting wax. "You don't have a choice," it growled. The door next to me swung open on its own, and a blast of cold air hit me. I tried to resist, pressing myself against the opposite side of the car, but something invisible wrapped around my body, pushing, pulling, forcing me out. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, and the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to look at the car, but it was already gone, disappearing into thin air like it had never been there at all. I stood in front of the house, my chest heaving, trying to make sense of what just happened. My phone buzzed in my pocket. When I pulled it out, the app for the Black Car Network was gone. In its place was a new app with no name, just a blank black icon. I tapped it, and the screen displayed a single instruction: "Enter your home." I looked at the house. It wasn't mine. Not really. But it felt like it wanted to be. The front door was open, just slightly, enough to invite me in. I stepped inside, and immediately I knew I'd made a mistake. The air was thick, heavy with the same metallic smell from the car. The furniture was the same as my apartment. Same couch, same coffee table, even the same framed photo of my parents on the wall. But the colors were wrong, muted, like they'd been drained of life. And then I saw it. Mr. sitting on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen. Its head turned slowly toward me, and it smiled. The same unnatural, too wide grin that haunted me in the car. "You're home," it said in my voice, but colder, flatter. I backed away, my legs shaking, but the door behind me was gone. Just like at the diner, the walls had shifted, trapping me inside. The other me stood up, moving toward me with slow, deliberate steps. "This is your place now," it said. "Time to take your seat." What do you mean?" I stammered, my back hitting the wall. It pointed to the couch. I don't know why, but my body moved on its own. My legs carried me to the couch, and I sat down, my hands gripping the armrests so tightly my knuckles turned white. The other me leaned in close, its face inches from mine. Its eyes were dark voids now, empty and endless. "Don't worry," it whispered. "I'll take care of everything. I don't know how long I've been sitting here. The TV never turns on, but I can see things in the screen's reflection. Faces, places, other passengers just like me, getting into their own black cars. The other me is gone now. I think it's out there somewhere, living my life, wearing my face. As for me, I'm just here, waiting for the next passenger." I paid for a dark web ritual that promised me immortality. Now, my shadow moves before I do. Okay, let me start by saying this. I'm not some tech genius or hacker. I barely know how to use a VPN, but somehow I ended up doing the stupidest thing imaginable. And now, I'm pretty sure I've cursed myself. It started like this. I was bored, like pandemic level bored. You know how everyone was baking sourdough bread and learning TikTok dances? Yeah, I was doing none of that. I was just scrolling through Reddit and YouTube, watching random deep web horror stories and analog horror videos. You know, the kind of stuff where some guy talks about creepy websites while using unsettling synth music in the background. I got hooked. I'm not proud of this, but after a few hours of listening to these stories, I started to think, how scary could it really be? I mean, half the stories are probably made up, right? Plus, the whole dark web thing just sounded like some urban legend parents tell their kids to keep them from downloading sketchy apps. So, curiosity got the better of me. I found a tutorial on YouTube. Ironically, it was a cheerful channel about ethical hacking. Downloaded Tor and jumped into the deep web. I know. Red flag number 1. But at the time, it didn't feel dangerous. I was sitting in my room with my LED lights set to cozy purple, a Starbucks iced coffee sweating on my desk, and my dog snoring on the floor. The vibe wasn't exactly sinister. At first, it was all disappointing. Lots of dead links, sketchy marketplaces selling overpriced junk, and forums full of people arguing about Bitcoin. But then, I found something that made my stomach drop. It was a forum called Eternity Exchange. The homepage was simple. Black background, white text, and a single sentence at the top. The cost of immortality is less than you think. Underneath, there was a list of services offered. Most of it was ridiculous. Rituals for wealth, summoning demons, LOL, guaranteed lottery wins. But one thread caught my eye. It was called the Forever Shadow Ritual. The description was vague, but it promised freedom from the constraints of time and a permanent extension of your soul's existence. In other words, immortality. The price? $200 in Bitcoin. Now, I don't know what possessed me to take it seriously. Maybe it was the weird way the description was written. It felt off, like it wasn't written by a human. Or maybe it was just the sheer audacity of it. Immortality for $200. That's cheaper than an iPhone. Still, I hesitated. It sounded insane, but the longer I stared at the screen, the more tempting it became. My life was going nowhere. I had just lost my job. My friends were all too busy to hang out, and I felt like I was wasting away in my tiny apartment. What if this was real? What if I was throwing away my only shot at something extraordinary? Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a joke, like a creepy prank someone set up to mess with idiots like me. And honestly, $200 wasn't that much. If anything, it'd make for a cool story to tell my friends. So, I did it. I transferred the Bitcoin, clicked the purchase button, and waited. About 20 minutes later, I got an email. No subject line, no sender info. Just an attachment labeled ritualinstructions.pdf. My heart was pounding as I opened it. The file was short, just a single page of text, but it was weirdly specific. The instructions went like this. Wait until midnight. Place a mirror on the floor facing upward. Turn off all lights and make sure the room is completely dark. Light a single candle and hold it in front of the mirror. Repeat the phrase, I offer my shadow to the keeper of eternity, 5 times. Blow out the candle and stare into the mirror for 1 full minute. The file ended with one final line. Do not break the gaze, no matter what you see. At this point, I was officially creeped out. The idea of doing this in my pitch black room at midnight felt wrong. But I'd already spent the money, so I figured I might as well go through with it. Besides, it wasn't like anything would actually happen, right? That night, I set everything up. I found an old mirror in my closet and placed it on the floor. I lit a cheap dollar store candle and turned off the lights. My room was silent, except for the occasional hum of cars passing outside. For some reason, the air felt heavier than usual, like I was sitting at the bottom of a swimming pool. I held the candle over the mirror and started the chant. I offer my shadow to the keeper of eternity. My voice sounded shaky, even to me. I repeated the phrase 4 more times, my breath fogging up the glass below. When I blew out the candle, the darkness swallowed me. I could barely see my reflection, but I forced myself to keep staring. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. Just me, squinting at my blurry outline in the mirror. But then, my reflection moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, except there was no light, and my shadow, it didn't match my movements. While I was perfectly still, the shadow raised its arm, like it was reaching for me. My stomach flipped, and I wanted to look away, but I remembered the warning, do not break the gaze. The shadow's arm stopped mid-air, then slowly sank back to its side. For a second, I thought it was over, but then it smiled. I didn't even know shadows could smile, but somehow, mine did. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, showing sharp, jagged teeth that weren't mine. That's when I broke. I scrambled backward, knocking the mirror over. The sound of it shattering echoed through the room, but when I turned on the lights, everything looked normal. No smiling shadow, just a broken mirror and a puddle of melted wax. I should have felt relieved, but something still felt off. It wasn't until the next day that I realized what it was. When I walked to the bathroom, I noticed my shadow wasn't following me. It was leading me, and every time I moved, it smiled. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that grin, the impossible, jagged stretch of teeth that didn't belong to me, or anyone, for that matter. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was tired, or I'd stared at the candle too long and freaked myself out. That's all it was, right? But when the sun came up, reality slapped me in the face. It started with something small, like my shadow moving before I did. I walked into the kitchen to make coffee, and when I reached for the fridge, I froze. My shadow had already beaten me to it. Its arm was extended, fingers wrapped around the shadow of the fridge handle, waiting for me to catch up. I just stood there, heart hammering in my chest. After a few seconds, the shadow reset itself, snapping back to match my position. I told myself it was a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me. I tried to brush it off. I really did. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Call 911 and say, "Hi, my shadow is acting weird." Instead, I pulled my hoodie on, grabbed my keys, and headed out. Maybe I just needed to be around people. A walk to the Starbucks down the street seemed like a good idea. Normal, comfortable. But as I walked down the sidewalk, I noticed something. My shadow wasn't just leading me anymore. It was doing things I wasn't. If I stopped to tie my shoe, my shadow kept walking a few steps before it froze, as if it realized I wasn't following. Then it would slide back into place, like nothing happened. When I turned the corner near the gas station, my shadow turned its head to look at me. It turned its head. I wasn't even moving my neck. By the time I got to Starbucks, my nerves were shot. I ordered something cold and sweet, hoping sugar and caffeine would snap me out of whatever was happening. The barista gave me one of those polite but concerned looks, the kind you give someone who's visibly unraveling, but you don't want to ask questions. I found a seat in the corner near the window, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. The sunlight streamed in, casting long, warm shadows over the floor. I glanced at mine. Big mistake. It wasn't sitting like I was. I was slouched forward, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around my drink. My shadow, though, it was sitting perfectly upright, its head tilted slightly toward me like it was watching, and then it did something that made my blood turn to ice. It waved. I don't remember leaving Starbucks. 1 second, I was staring at that impossible wave, and the next, I was back in my apartment, slamming the door behind me like I was trying to lock something out. My dog, Max, trotted up to me, tail wagging, but when he looked down at my shadow, he froze. His tail dropped, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Max was the friendliest dog in the world. He once tried to befriend a raccoon, so seeing him act like this sent me into full panic mode. "Stop it, Max. There's nothing there," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't listen. His growls turned to whimpers, and he backed away, his eyes locked on the shadow that was now standing eerily still. I scooped him up and carried him to my bedroom, locking the door behind us. I didn't know what else to do. That's when I remembered the instructions, specifically the last line: "Do not break the gaze, no matter what you see." I broke it. I shattered the mirror, turned on the lights, and ran. And now I was starting to think I'd broken something much bigger. I spent the rest of the day trying to avoid anything that could cast a shadow. I drew all the curtains, turned on every light in the apartment, and kept my back pressed against the wall like a paranoid lunatic. I didn't even check my phone, which was probably for the best, because I didn't want to see if my shadow had made it into my selfies. But even with all the lights on, I couldn't escape it. Every time I caught a glimpse of my shadow, it was out of sync. Like when I reached for my glass of water, my shadow's hand stayed by my side, then jerked upward a second later. Or when I walked to the bathroom, its legs took a different number of steps than mine. These weren't subtle differences. They were deliberate. The worst part? The smile was always there, stretched wide, like it knew something I didn't. That night, things got worse. I had left my laptop on the couch, so I decided to do some research. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. My shadow is broken. Weird side effects of dark web rituals. I ended up falling into another deep web rabbit hole, looking for anything about shadows or the keeper of eternity. Most of the sites were garbage, creepy pasta forums and sketchy pages that hadn't been updated since 2008. But one link stood out. It didn't have a title, just a string of random letters and numbers. But when I clicked it, I felt my stomach drop. The page was a pitch black background with a single image in the center, a grinning silhouette. The smile was identical to mine, or rather, my shadow's. Below the image, there was a single sentence: "What you've given cannot be returned." I slammed my laptop shut so hard, I'm surprised it didn't break. My hands were shaking, and Max was barking his head off in the bedroom. I ran to check on him, but when I opened the door, he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the corner. At first, I thought it was just a shadow cast by the lamp, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't connected to anything. It was just standing there, a pitch black silhouette with that same too wide grin. I froze, and so did Max. The thing didn't move. It just watched. And then, in a low, guttural voice, it said my name. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because my throat was raw, and Max was barking like crazy. I grabbed him and bolted out of the apartment, not even stopping to grab my keys. I didn't care. I couldn't stay there. I ended up crashing at a friend's place that night. I didn't tell them what happened because, honestly, how do you explain something like this without sounding insane? But even in their brightly lit guest room, I couldn't escape. Every time I moved, I felt like my shadow was deliberately lagging behind, like it wanted me to notice. And every time I glanced at it, it was smiling. I thought maybe I could just avoid it. Avoid mirrors. Avoid anything that cast a shadow. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. I hadn't just bought some dumb dark web ritual. I'd bought a curse. And whatever I'd summoned, it wasn't done with me yet. When I woke up at my friend Jake's place the next morning, I thought, for a blissful half-second, that everything was normal. The guest room was bathed in soft morning light, and Max was curled up next to me, snoring. For a brief, stupid moment, I almost convinced myself that it had all been some kind of vivid nightmare. But then I noticed the shadows. The sunlight filtering through the blinds cast them in sharp relief on the walls and ceiling, and they weren't mine. They moved independently, twitching and shifting like they were alive. One stretched long and thin across the ceiling, curling at the edges like smoke. Another crouched in the far corner, trembling as if it was trying to hold itself together. And then there was the one standing by the door. It had no features, no face, but I knew it was looking at me. Max woke up and immediately started barking, his small body trembling as he stared at the door. I slowly sat up, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The shadow didn't move either. It just stood there, silent, waiting, watching. When I finally managed to pull myself out of bed, the shadow melted away, sliding under the door and vanishing. It didn't make sense. Shadows don't move like that. But this wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something else. I didn't stick around to explain any of this to Jake. I just grabbed Max, mumbled something about needing to take care of an emergency, and bolted. He looked confused, but didn't press me, probably because I looked like I hadn't slept in weeks. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. What was I supposed to say? Hey, by the way, my shadow might kill me, so I'm skipping town for a bit. I spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about going to a hotel or even sleeping in my car, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The shadow wasn't tied to my apartment or any one location. It was tied to me. By the time the sun started to set, I'd made up my mind. I was going back to the source. I needed to find that forum, the eternity exchange, and figure out how to undo whatever I'd done. Finding it was harder than I thought. The deep web is like a shifting maze, and most of the links I tried were either broken or led to dead ends. The more I searched, the more I started to feel like the forum had been erased, like it had disappeared the moment I completed the ritual. But then, just when I was about to give up, I found it. The same black background, the same ominous tagline. The cost of immortality is less than you think. The thread for the forever shadow ritual was still there, but this time there was something new. A warning in bold red text at the top of the page. Do not complete the ritual. There is no reversal. All sales final. My stomach churned. I scrolled through the thread, looking for anything that might tell me how to fix this. Most of the comments were from people like me, skeptics, thrill seekers, or just idiots with too much time and money. But a few stood out. They were short, cryptic posts, written in broken English or weirdly formal language, like they weren't written by humans at all. One said, The keeper does not return what is given. Another read, the shadow becomes the soul's anchor. Do not let it gain control. But the last comment was the worst. It wasn't cryptic or vague. It was a single, clear sentence that made my blood run cold. If your shadow smiles, it is already too late. I slammed my laptop shut and leaned back, my heart racing. The room was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced down at the floor, and that's when I saw it. My shadow was standing, even though I was sitting. Its head tilted slightly to the side, and its mouth stretched into that same jagged smile. I didn't even think. I grabbed my laptop, Max's leash, and my car keys, and ran. I wasn't sure where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. As I stumbled out into the night, I felt a strange pull, like my shadow was tugging at me, trying to drag me back inside. But I kept going, not daring to look back. I ended up driving to a 24-hour McDonald's. It wasn't exactly safe or private, but it was bright, and there were other people around. I parked in the corner of the lot and just sat there for a while, trying to collect my thoughts. Max was curled up in the passenger seat, his head resting on my lap, and for the first time in hours, I felt a tiny flicker of hope. Maybe if I stayed in the light, it couldn't reach me. But that hope didn't last long. As I stared out the window, I saw something move in the reflection of the glass. At first, I thought it was someone walking past the car, but when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a person. It was a shadow. My shadow. It was on the outside of the car, standing in the reflection like it was trapped between the glass and the night. It raised one hand and placed it against the window, fingers splayed wide. Then, slowly, it leaned forward until its face was inches from mine. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, and though there was no sound, I could feel it whispering, not with my ears, but in my head. Let me in. I threw the car into reverse and sped out of the lot, tires screeching. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. Every time I move, my shadow moves first, like it's trying to lead me somewhere. And every time I look at it, the smile is wider, sharper, like it's waiting for something. I can't help but think about that comment on the forum. The shadow becomes the soul's anchor. Do not let it gain control. What does that even mean? And how do I stop it? Last night, I tried something desperate. I waited until midnight, turned off all the lights, and sat in front of a new mirror I'd bought at Target. I thought maybe if I repeated the ritual, I could undo it. Maybe I could give the shadow back to the keeper, or whatever I'd summoned. But when I lit the candle and looked into the mirror, my shadow wasn't there. The reflection showed me, sitting alone in the dark, the candle flickering weakly in my hand. And then, just as I was about to blow it out, I saw something move behind me. It wasn't my shadow. It was something else. A tall, dark figure with no face and a mouth that stretched all the way across its head. It leaned down, its grin inches from my ear, and whispered one word. Soon. I didn't sleep after the encounter in the mirror. How could I? That word, soon, was etched into my brain, looping over and over like a broken record. I spent the rest of the night pacing around my apartment, checking every corner for shadows that didn't belong, and jumping at every small sound. Even Max, usually a little bundle of calm, stayed on edge, growling at empty spaces and refusing to leave my side. Morning didn't make things better. The sunlight didn't feel warm or safe anymore. It felt invasive, harsh, like it was highlighting every detail of my situation. And the shadows, they didn't go away. They didn't even shrink like they were supposed to. Instead, they stretched unnaturally long, curling around corners and pooling in places the light should have erased. It wasn't just my shadow now. It was all the shadows. I tried to distract myself. I turned on the TV, scrolled through TikTok, and even opened up a game on my phone. But nothing held my attention. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, small, subtle shifts in the shadows around me, a flicker near the bookshelf, a ripple under the couch, the faint outline of a hand pressing against the wall. At one point, I even grabbed a broom and started swinging it at the air like an idiot, hoping to prove I was imagining things. I wasn't. The second the broom entered the shadow near the fridge, it snapped in half, the wood splintering like it had hit solid concrete. I dropped the pieces and backed away, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. That's when my phone buzzed. The notification was from an app I didn't recognize. It didn't have a name or icon, just a blank square in the middle of my screen. For a moment, I debated deleting it outright, but curiosity and sheer desperation got the better of me. I tapped it. The screen went black, then filled with a single message in white text. "The Keeper accepts your sacrifice." My stomach churned. What sacrifice? I hadn't done anything, unless breaking the mirror counted, or breaking the gaze during the ritual. Either way, I wasn't about to sit around and wait to find out. I needed answers. I drove out to the one place I thought I could get help, the library. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I'd read somewhere that public libraries sometimes had access to old books and occult archives that weren't available online. If anyone had information on the Keeper of Eternity, or whatever I'd summoned, it was going to be there. The drive was surreal. Every shadow along the road seemed to shift and stretch as I passed, warping into impossible shapes that followed me in my peripheral vision. At one point, a shadow the size of a small car darted across the street, and I swerved so hard I nearly hit a lamppost. When I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. By the time I pulled into the library parking lot, my nerves were shot. I sat in the car for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to steady my breathing. Max whimpered softly in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on something outside the window. I didn't want to know what he was looking at. Inside the library, I headed straight for the reference desk. The librarian was an older woman with thin, wire-rimmed glasses and a scarf that looked like it had been knit sometime during the Reagan administration. She raised an eyebrow as I approached, probably because I looked like I'd just crawled out of a horror movie. Hi, I stammered. I'm looking for information on shadow rituals, or maybe dark web occult stuff. Do you have anything like that? Her expression didn't change. Occult books are in the 133 section, she said flatly, pointing toward a row of shelves in the back. But we don't carry anything illegal, if that's what you're asking. I nodded quickly and shuffled off, feeling her gaze linger on me as I walked away. The 133rd section was small and dusty, filled with books about astrology, ghost stories, and magic with a K. Most of it looked like nonsense, but one title caught my eye. The Shadows We Cast, a study of ancient soul rites. I pulled it off the shelf and flipped through it, skimming for anything that mentioned shadows or immortality. On page 87, I found something that made my blood run cold. The chapter was titled Soul Anchors and the Price of Eternity. It described an ancient practice where people would bind their shadows to extend their lives. According to the text, the shadow wasn't just a part of you, it was a reflection of your soul. By offering it to a higher entity, you could anchor your existence and avoid death. But there was a catch. The more power you gave the shadow, the more control it gained over you. If the shadow grew too strong, it could take on a life of its own, severing itself from you entirely. The book called this phenomenon the unbound, and it described them as soulless beings driven by hunger and malice. At the bottom of the page, there was a single handwritten note in red ink. If your shadow smiles, it has already begun to replace you. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back on the shelf. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to my phone as I tried to Google more about the unbound or soul anchors, but nothing came up. The internet was useless. Whatever I'd done, it was old, ancient, and there was no clear way to fix it. As I turned to leave, the fluorescent lights above me flickered. The shadows on the walls rippled, stretching toward me like long, grasping fingers. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavy, like the entire room was holding its breath. And then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh. It didn't come from the shadows or the corners of the room. It came from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty library aisle and the faint echo of that horrible, inhuman sound. I didn't wait to hear it again. I bolted for the exit, practically dragging Max behind me. Back in the car, I locked the doors and checked the time. It was 9:17 p.m. The sun was long gone, and the parking lot was bathed in harsh yellow light from the street lamps. My shadow stretched across the dashboard, long and distorted, but it wasn't sitting still. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, its hands rising to press against the inside of the windshield, and its mouth was grinning wider than ever. That night, I didn't go home. I didn't know where to go. I ended up driving to a nearby Walmart, one of those massive 24-hour ones that always feels a little liminal, like it exists outside of normal time. The bright fluorescent lights inside felt like the only safe place left. But as I wandered the aisles, trying to pretend everything was normal, I realized something terrifying. No one else had a shadow. Not the employees, not the shoppers, not even Max. Just me. And mine? It wasn't following anymore. It was leading. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was the only one with a shadow. It didn't make sense. How could I not have noticed this sooner? As I stood frozen in the middle of the Walmart cereal aisle, my shadow loomed large on the floor, its movements erratic and disconnected from my own. It twitched, shuddering, like it was barely holding itself together. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it turned its head toward me. It smiled, not a quick grin or a flicker of teeth, but a slow, deliberate stretch of its mouth that seemed to take forever. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something else, something that knew me, something that had been watching me for days, biding its time. My knees went weak. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder than usual, and for a second, I thought they might go out. I looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to see what was happening. But the other shoppers moved on, oblivious, their faces blank and distant, like they were part of the background in a dream. Even Max, pressed nervously against my leg, refused to look at my shadow. I had to get out of there. Now the parking lot was empty, except for my car, its windows reflecting the dull orange glow of the streetlights. The second I stepped outside, I felt it, the oppressive, suffocating weight of the darkness pressing down on me. Every shadow in the lot seemed alive, writhing and stretching toward me as I hurried to the car. My own shadow danced and twisted in ways it shouldn't have, curling along the pavement and darting ahead of me like it was leading me somewhere. Max refused to move, his claws scraping against the pavement as I dragged him along. I didn't have time to argue. I scooped him up, yanked the door open, and threw us both inside. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the driver's side window. My blood turned to ice. I didn't want to look, but some terrible instinct made me turn my head. The window was empty. No person, no face, just the black, grinning outline of my shadow, its hand pressed flat against the glass. And then it moved, not on the glass, but inside the car. The shadow's grin widened, splitting its face in two as it spread across the dashboard, the seats, and the ceiling. It moved like oil, slick and unnatural, pooling in the corners of the car and dripping onto the floor. Max whimpered, pressing himself into my lap as the temperature dropped. My breath fogged the windshield, and the air grew thick with the stench of burnt wood and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. The shadow spoke, not out loud, but in my head. Its voice was low and guttural, layered with an unnatural echo that made my skull feel like it was vibrating. You broke the contract. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even breathe. The shadow pulsed, rippling across the car like it was alive. The keeper has come to collect. I fumbled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks clicked down on their own, trapping me inside. My heart pounded in my chest as the shadow began to take shape, rising from the seat beside me like a figure emerging from deep water. It was tall and thin, its head brushing the roof of the car, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was nothing but that same impossible grin. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know." The shadow tilted its head, its grin growing impossibly wider. "Ignorance does not absolve you." In a blind panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my phone. My fingers trembled as I opened the camera app, pointing it at the shadow. Maybe I thought I could record it, prove it was real, or maybe I was just desperate for any kind of light. The flash went off. For a split second, the shadow recoiled, its grin flickering like static on a broken TV. But then it surged forward, faster than I could react. The phone flew out of my hands, and the screen cracked as it hit the floor. The shadow loomed over me, its mouth inches from my face. "You cannot escape. You cannot hide. You are mine." I don't know how I got out of the car. 1 second, I was trapped, and the next, I was stumbling across the parking lot, gasping for air. The shadow didn't follow, not immediately. It stayed inside the car, its grinning silhouette pressed against the fogged-up windows, watching me. Max barked frantically, pulling at his leash. He wanted to run, but I didn't know where to go. No matter how far I ran, the shadow would find me. It was part of me. It was me. And then I remembered the book. The shadow becomes the soul's anchor. If the shadow was an anchor, maybe I could sever it. Maybe I could destroy it before it destroyed me. The thought was insane, but it was the only thing I had left. I drove to the only place that made sense, the park by the river. It was dark and empty, the kind of place you'd normally avoid at night. But tonight, the darkness felt almost comforting. I parked near the edge of the water and grabbed the only weapon I could find, a cheap Bic lighter I'd forgotten in my glove box. The shadow appeared before I even stepped out of the car. It stretched across the ground, taller and more monstrous than ever, its grin gleaming like a knife in the moonlight. It didn't wait this time. It surged toward me, twisting and writhing like a living thing. I flicked the lighter. The tiny flame sputtered to life, casting a dim glow that barely pushed back the shadows. But it was enough. The shadow hesitated, recoiling slightly as the fire danced in my hand. I didn't think. I just acted. I dropped the lighter onto the ground and kicked it into the pool of shadow that had formed around my feet. The flame caught instantly, spreading across the darkness like gasoline on fire. The shadow shrieked, a horrible, ear-piercing sound that made my head feel like it was splitting in two. And then it was gone. When I looked down, the ground was blackened, scorched in a perfect circle where the shadow had been. Max whimpered at my side, his tail wagging nervously. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But then I saw it, in the reflection of the river, just beyond the edge of the water. The shadow was still there. It wasn't grinning anymore. It was just watching, waiting. That was 3 days ago. I haven't seen my shadow since, but I can feel it. It's still out there, somewhere, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I don't know what will happen when it comes back, but I know one thing for sure. You can't bargain with eternity. You can only delay it. And one day, it will come to collect,